Hi everybody and welcome back. So in this video, I'm doing a request basically by actually a couple of followers on YouTube that reached out and said, could you do a video on just giant scale and not a particular aircraft, but what's it like to own a giant scale airplane? What are some of the considerations that you have to think about? So, and I know I've touched on this a little bit in other videos, but this one I'm trying to really talk about the ownership. What are you going to have to do if you own a giant scale airplane and do it safely? So basically we're going to talk about how big of an airplane are you flying. You know, if it's an 80-inch, nowadays that's not really that big. There's some ARFs that are that big. Okay, back in the day, if it was over 80 inches, you normally were a part of the IMAA, International Miniature Aircraft Association. But there was no governing body that said you couldn't fly over 80 inches. Okay, it wasn't like an AMA rule. But basically, over 80 was considered giant scale. For me, it's over 150 inches. Okay, you got to think about, excuse me, when you're on the field. And what that means is, how big are your taxiways? How can you move it around? Where can you store it at night? Stuff like that. Transportation, how are you getting it to the field and back to go flying? The pre-flight, I'm going to barely touch on this. I've done a video specifically on pre-flighting an RC airplane, so you might want to go watch that. I'm going to talk very mildly about the flying responsibilities of flying a giant scale airplane, and then we're going to touch base on the AMA over 55-pound rules. Okay? So to get this started, I want to show some pictures and talk about how big your plane is. But first of all, I want to give a little bit of credit to Jenny Alderman, the photographer who did some incredible pictures of my MSL2 here. And she is just awesome. And there's 2 or 3 pictures in here, and she's given me permission to use them as I will, but incredible photographer. But when you think about how big an airplane is, you know, this plane is 188 inches. And when you see me fly it, I fly it very scale-like. I don't yank and bank this airplane. But I still try to do, at like a fly-in, or if I'm doing a noon demo, I still try to do maneuvers that kind of awes the audience. You know, it excites people. You know, we all want to. One thing I love to do with this airplane is touch and goes on one wheel, stuff like that. But you need to think about the inertia, the size of the airplane. It's not agile. Okay, it's not an most giant scale airplanes are not real aerobatic. There's a few that are made that way, but most of the people have never flown them really that aerobatic. It's getting down to the smaller airplanes that you see people getting crazy. But you have to decide for yourself, you know, will it fit in my trunk? And we'll talk about that with transportation. Will it fit on the field I'm flying at? Is it too big for the field I'm flying at? You know, we're going to cover all of that in a minute, but you need to think about how big do you want, and what is how big to you? To me, back in the days, 80 inches was big because at that point you became IMAA legal, which means the International Miniature Aeronautic Club. 80 inches is huge. Okay, to me, you got to be over 150 inches to be giant scale nowadays. Okay, and you need to also understand the logistics of it. Okay, getting it to the field and all that stuff, and we'll dive into that. But you just got to decide if it's an 80-inch plane and it's giant enough for you, awesome. If you want to fly 188 and that's perfect for you, awesome. Don't let anybody try to tell you, oh, you're crazy for flying giant scale because it takes forever to set up the field. That is a bunch of BS. Okay, my MSL2 takes me maybe 10 minutes to set up at the field and get it airworthy. Well, it takes 10 minutes to assemble it and about 15 minutes to do my first pre-flight, because every time I assemble the airplane, I do a very deep dive pre-flight on it, okay? Before we get too far into this, I want to talk about my sponsor. If you need servo screws, blind nuts, washers, metric standard, any of those little fasteners, go to RTL Fasteners. If you buy more than $50 of product and you use the code DA30, you'll get 30% off your order. It's a really exciting company. So now what I want to talk about is on the field. This is the MSL1. The reason I've got the airplane by the wingtip there is because I do not have a steerable tail. I don't have brakes, and it does not have a steerable tail wheel. So just like the World War I airplanes where they always had somebody on the wingtip to help kind of guide it around when it was taxiing, that's what I have to do with this airplane. So I treat it basically like it's a full-scale airplane. Another thing to consider is how big is the pits? Where's it going to fit in the pits? Okay. If you're going to assemble it once and leave it up for like a 3-day fly-in, do you have a tent to put it in at night? Or are you going to let the dew fall on it? And God forbid it gets rained on. So there's considerations with giant airplanes that you really have to think about. And how this ties into safety is that an airplane that is, how do I say this? An airplane that people are always bumping into or knocking into, or you get hanger rash, but you can also get damaged servos. Okay, I had a servo one time that was damaged because somebody had looked at the airplane and moved the big aileron, and they had actually run the servo past top dead center. And then when I went to turn the system on and tried to find it, it broke some gears in the servo. Now, this was a long time ago when servos were a lot junkier, and now I got all metal gear. But if I wouldn't have pre-flighted that airplane, I wouldn't realize one of my servos had taken a dump. So it's really important you think of the area. You need to think, the taxis big enough where I'm going to get up and down the taxiway? 197 inches, you don't want to be hitting people and planes and tents. So it's a consideration you got to make. You've got to also then, like I said earlier, if it's going to rain or there's dew, do you have a tent? I could turn the MSL-1 sideways and slide it in there and have no problems. Okay? And but then you have to think about the investment. Okay? What's your investment for the tent? Are you willing to spend a couple of $100 or maybe $300 for a tent? Are you going to be willing to modify the tent? Like I took my tent and modified it with a suspension bracket so that I don't need the center two poles during the day, and my tent works as a hanger for my airplane. I can just back the MSL2 right into the hanger, just like the MSL1. Now, I've done some beefing up of my tent, and I've got 30-inch stakes in the ground so that I can put the airplane and tight down at night, and wind and rain, knock on wood, has not ever gotten to it. But it's something that you got to consider with a giant scale airplane. Where are you going to put it? Are you going to break it back down and put it in your trailer? Going to break it back down and put it in your car? It's just something to think about. You're not just going to be able to sit in the back of a van. Okay? So, and now we're going to talk about transportation for a minute. One of the biggest investments I did in the hobby was buy this trailer. It's a 16-foot V-nose, so I've got about 17 and a half feet length. Here you can see the B-36 fuselage is in there, and the MSL-1's up on that deck. And this was the day before I left for CEF back in 2010, I think, or 2012. And I still have this trailer, and it's just bulletproof. But it's one of the best investments I've had. But then you've got to ask yourself, are you going to leave all these airplanes in your trailer? If you don't, which you shouldn't, because trailers get really hot in the summer, are you going to store it in your garage? Is your wife okay with that? I rented a storage unit, which is about the size of a one-car garage, because I keep all my airplanes in that storage unit when they're not going to a flying field. Because my neighborhood won't let me build an aircraft hangar because of the homeowners association. So you got a big enough garage, you got a big enough attic. You know, is your wife going to let you put all your airplanes in the guest bedroom? You've got to really think about giant scale airplanes, where you're going to put them, okay? Then the pre-flight, and this is the way I do my pre-flights, and I'm not going to dive into the deep of this because I've already done a video about it. But basically, when I set it up, I do a deep dive pre-flight. Each morning, I go through what I call a level 2 pre-flight. I'm a nerd. And then before each flight, I have a level 3. So the level 1 is a deep dive. A level 2 is to make sure nothing has changed since the day before. And a level 3 is check the batteries, check the make sure all flying surfaces are tight and they're moving. I'll jiggle the hinges. I will grab my propeller and move the motor mount a little bit to see if anything's gotten sloppy. Now, I won't do that with anything armed. If you fly electric, you must use an arm switch for your ESC. Because if you accidentally hit the throttle and everything's plugged in, that prop can cut a hand, fingers, elbow, head off. It could be a disaster. Now I want to talk about flying. And this is interesting, okay? And I really want to, I don't know how to stress to you that the size of the airplane will play tricks on you. And I call it flying into a corner. Flying into a corner is when you start running out of options and your brain starts to overload, and it can lead to panic. I try to always know where I'm leading my airplane. Any maneuver I've ever done, I've done at least 50 times. If I go to a fly-in or I'm doing a noon demo, you never do a first maneuver at those things, because our egos want us to. Our egos want us to make people clap and roar and laugh and be ooh, ah. But if you've designed the right flight regiment, You can do that because they've never seen it. Just because it might be boring to you, they've never seen it, and that's all that counts. But when you look at this, this is kind of an illustration of a 60-inch biplane, Stearman. And if you think about flying it, you normally only just, fire it up and fly it, right? But when you're flying a giant scale, there's some other considerations. Always use a spotter. Always use common sense. Don't ever experiment the first time on a maneuver when you're at a fly-in or at doing a noon demo. Know the field. And what I mean by that is, one of my first giant scale airplanes was a Byron Sukhoi. And we flew at this little bitty field where on the other end of the cornfield, the backside was a neighborhood. And we weren't allowed to fly over the neighborhood. And we had people stand out there, and we learned where to fly that we wouldn't go over the neighborhood. Okay? So I take this Sukhoi off, which was 80 inches, the biggest airplane. Most of my planes then were 54 and 60 inches. So, and this is a weird phenomenon. We get used to seeing how big the pilot's head is, how big the cockpit is, how big the the vertical stab is. We visually think our planes are so far away from us. So as I flew the Sukhoi in the downwind really fast, I then started seeing my shadow on rooftops and realized, oh my God, I'm over that neighborhood. I had no idea my Sukhoi was probably 100 yards out farther than the smaller airplanes I had flown. Okay? And another time that I really flew into a corner and it could have been an absolute disaster is I had a half-scale Pitts. And I was up at the AMA field in Muncie, Indiana at the headquarters. And it was just me, my wife, and about 50 yards to my right was a bunch of free flight guys that were just absolutely awesome to spend the day with. They had the rubber band free flights. It was so cool. But this is what's weird. I had a Goldberg Chipmunk, highly modified, a huge rudder. I could just fly it, yank and bank it, drive it like a sports car. So I'd put in about 5 or 6 flights on it, and then I took my Pitts up. And one thing I love to do is go down the runway about 10 feet in the air, and I do an inside loop, and then I come right back out at about 10 feet off the ground. Okay, a big loop. When I got to this point of the loop with my Pitts, I then realized that airplane looks really big. And I was probably 50 feet lower than I should have been. Now, if I was a really good pilot, I would have just Immelmaned out of it, just rolled out of it, or split S'd it. But I continued the loop for some stupid reason. And I think it was just because mentally I was already committed to that maneuver. So right as I got to here, I realized I had the stick almost all the way back, which if you watch my other videos, you don't have the stick back and not have the throttle almost at full. Well, I had the throttle off because I was coming out of a loop. So I immediately hammered the throttle, and the wings started to wobble, and I was stalling, and I let it off, and I thought, oh my God, I'm going to fly the plane right into the ground right in front of all of us. It came literally leveled out about 6 inches off the ground, and my knees went into like 4,000 RPM shaking. But what ran through my mind is the plane, when it started to wiggle the wings, it was trying to snap. And if it would have, it could have hit me, my wife, it could have hit the free flight guys behind me. So I flew into a corner because visually I didn't realize how much of a difference my Goldberg Chipmunk looked like in the air versus my giant scale, half scale Pitts. Okay, so when you start to think about it, and we look at this next illustration, so imagine you've got a 60-inch biplane and you're in the downwind, and then you've got a 120-inch biplane and you're in the downwind. They probably will visually look almost the exact same size to you standing on the ground, but your biplane is maybe another quarter mile out, the big one, the 120-inch one. So, and when things get farther out, we don't see, even though we can see the airplane, we don't understand, we don't get the sense of speed. We don't get this sense of, are we going too fast, too slow? I hate flying far out. I learned to control line fly at first. So a lot of people look at me and say, you know, Damon, why do you fly so low to the ground? Well, if you notice when I fly low to the ground, I'm never doing it toward the pits. Okay? So what I want to talk about now is, if you know your airplane and you know it well, and you're at a fly-in or you're doing a noon demo, have in your mind a routine that's already figured out, okay? So when you think of the MSL-1, I always love to go down the runway with one wheel on the ground. But if you notice, I'm always going away from the audience. I never do a maneuver toward the audience. I cringe when I'm at these fly-ins, and I'm not going to talk about who or what kind of airplane, but something that flies toward the pits and then goes up, or it's doing this enormous 360, 6 inches off the ground right in front of us, that terrifies me, because all it takes is a servo arm or a servo gear or a glitch, and something's coming into the audience or the pits. And all of my maneuvers are done away. I don't even like to do figure eights for a noon demo because I'm flying 45 degrees at the audience 2 times in that maneuver. If you see me at a fly-in or doing a noon demo, I'll normally fly almost all the way to the end of the runway, fly out, you know, midfield, not crosswind. Yeah, the crosswind. I'll enter the downwind, but when I'm turning downwind to base, it's normally off the end of the runway where there are no spectators. And then as I'm turning base to final, that little bit of time I'm aiming toward the audience, I'm still outside of the pits, line of pits people, or the audience. And then if I want to do a maneuver, I'll come in and I'll bank and fly away. One thing I love to do with my giant airplanes is when I take off, I get about 5 inches in the air, and then I drop one wing almost touching the ground, and I'll curve away, and the audience is like, oh, that's so cool, you're flying so low. If I caught the wings up on the ground, I'm going to crash going away from the audience. So look, and I'm not saying small airplanes can't kill you just as quick. They can. But I'm saying there's something inherent about giant scale airplanes. They react slower. There's a lot more mass. There's a lot more to think about than some of the smaller airplanes that we're really used to. Okay? So I hope this all is just abundantly clear that there's so many things to think about safety when you're flying giant airplanes. Okay? So the MSL-1 here, you know, like I said, I had over 1,000 flights. Even this airplane only took 15 minutes to set up at the field. You know, there are people on RC groups and everything says, oh, I wouldn't fly an airplane like that because it takes 3 people to set it up. I don't know anybody who has giant airplanes that let other people set it up for them except one person. Okay? Everybody else I know is afraid of somebody, you know, breaking the joiner tube or doing something to their airplane. I don't let anybody touch my airplanes when I assemble them because I'm responsible for my airplane. This airplane, the longest it takes me to set it up, because I got 2 sawhorses, I lay the wings on, they slide into these little spigot things, I can put the rigging on, I can get this airplane put together in 15 minutes, and then it takes me 15 minutes to do the first pre-flight checklist. But these rumors of taking an hour to assemble an airplane at the field is just hogwash. I mean, I've owned a bunch of giant scale airplanes, and none of them take more than 15 minutes to set up at the field. None of them. So, but now what I want to talk about is the AMA 55 pounds and over. And I know this video is going long, everybody. If you're still watching it, you're dedicated, and I love you. But one of the things that's really neat is the AMA has an over 55 pounds. So what does that mean? Is LMA1 means if you're over 55 pounds, but don't exceed 77 pounds, 2 ounces. Okay, that's a certain classification, and I'll talk in a minute what that means. The next classification is LMA2, 77 pounds up to 125. Now, this is propeller-driven airplanes. There is the LTMA1, which I have nothing to do with because that's turbines only. And then there's the LTMA2, which is turbines up to 100 pounds. But propeller-driven airplanes can go up to 125 pounds. Okay. I have no airplanes that are the LMA2 right now. I have none. And I'll explain why. So when you think about the LMA1, almost all the documentation is created by the builder, owner, and person going to fly it. So if you're LMA1, you do the builder's decorations, a temporary authorization to fly, the permit to fly, inspection checklist, and that's all done by you. When you go to fly it, It has to be witnessed by a CD or whatever it says down there. Demonstration flight has to be done by a lead member, a CD, or an LMA inspector are required. So what's nice about LMA1 is you as the builder can do all the inspections yourself. Then you have to do test flights where either a CD or the other usual suspects have to witness it, sign off your paperwork, and then you send all of this back to the AMA with your, I think it's $25, and you're good to go for three years, okay? But if you're LMA2, you have to have the LMA inspector inspect your airplane, which isn't a big deal, but you've got to coordinate all of that. You've got to make sure that as you're building the airplane, the inspector can look inside as you're building it. If you have not taken a boatload of pictures of your build and the inspector doesn't know how to look inside some of your important parts of your airplane, they may not give you the waiver. But LMA1 to me is the sweet spot for me because I can build giant airplanes up to 77 pounds pretty easy, okay? So that's pretty much it, everybody. There's so much rumor and so much BS out there about flying giant scale airplanes. They can be done safely, but there is a responsibility you have as a pilot to make sure you're not endangering people. Just like flying a little EDF that goes 150 miles an hour, you've got to show some responsibility on that. But a big airplane has a lot of inertia. I mean, think about this. You've got a small airplane and the propeller on it is 8 inches and it turns, let's say, 15,000 RPM. If that hits a person, it's going to cut them up. You take a 9 horsepower 32-inch propeller and let it go flying into the pits, chopping away at people, and you're going to have a lot of people hurt, probably not just one. So that's the whole thing for me is giant scale. Giant scale is going to take out a lot more people than one small airplane. Okay? So sorry for going so long, everybody. I have such a deep passion for giant scale, and I'm going to defend all of the trolls and all the people that say it takes forever to set them up. You know, they're dangerous. Some of them are just hangar queens that sit around forever and never fly. You know, there's just all this noise that comes from people, which is just BS. So if you want to fly giant scale, have a blast. I'm doing videos on design. You'll have many setbacks when you're building big airplanes. You just got to ignore the naysayers and keep going forward. And that's pretty much it, everybody. So, hey, have a great day. Rock on, be safe, and keep the emails coming. I love them. So far, I have about a 98% positivity rate from all of you, so I must be doing something right. And leave in the comments what kind of videos you want to see, okay? And I'll see you next time. Take care. Bye.